The days after the encounter at the motel blurred together in a haze of fear and exhaustion. Daniel moved through his life like a shadow of himself, performing the duties of a pastor on autopilot. His sermons lacked the passion that once lifted congregations, his words flat and hurried as though he wanted to escape the pulpit rather than stand in it. Church members whispered about his distracted manner, and Caroline noticed his distant gaze at the dinner table, though she assumed he was burdened by church business. Inside, however, Daniel was consumed by the tightening grip of Alex's control. The first text message came only 2 days after the meeting, a short reminder of who truly held the power. Attached was a screenshot of their conversations, proof of his betrayal. Daniel deleted the message almost immediately, but the image burned into his memory. The demands began small, modest amounts of money transferred discreetly, deposits into accounts under unfamiliar names. Daniel obeyed, convincing himself that if he complied quickly, it might all end sooner. But each payment only led to more requests. The man seemed to enjoy pushing him deeper into despair, testing how far Daniel would go to protect his reputation. Sleepless nights became routine. He would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, Caroline breathing softly beside him, while his mind replayed Alex's threats over and over. Every sound outside the house made him jump. Every phone notification sent his pulse racing. Paranoia took root, and Daniel began to imagine that people around him could already sense his secret. The congregation became both his refuge and his nightmare. Standing before them, he felt exposed, as though every pair of eyes could see through the polished suit and recognize the shame beneath. He cut his sermons shorter, avoided conversations after service, and hurried home without lingering. Members who had once seen him as approachable now found him cold and withdrawn. The disconnect widened the rift inside him, the gap between the image of Pastor Cooper and the man trapped under blackmail. The pressure escalated when Alex's messages shifted from money to something darker. He demanded another meeting, this time face to face, with instructions that left Daniel's hands trembling as he read them. The demand was clear. Bring money taken directly from church funds, a guarantee of loyalty that would ensure his silence. The request crossed a line Daniel had prayed would never come. Stealing from the church was more than a crime. It was a betrayal of everything he had sworn to uphold. Yet the threat of exposure hung so heavy that even this seemed like an option. His mind warred with itself, torn between the morality he preached and the desperation clawing at him. In the days leading to the meeting, Daniel's paranoia deepened into obsession. He avoided eye contact with Caroline, afraid she might glimpse the storm in his soul. His children's laughter, once a source of joy, now pierced him with guilt he could not bear. He considered confessing, laying the truth bare, and asking for forgiveness, but fear always won. The image of his wife's heartbreak, his congregation's disgust, and the community's judgment silenced any thought of honesty. He convinced himself that facing Alex again was the only path forward, even though it felt like walking willingly into quicksand. When the night arrived, he drove to the motel with a hollow determination. He had decided not to bring the money, a choice born of desperation rather than courage. His hands clutched the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened, and his eyes stayed locked on the dark stretch of road, as though escape might appear if he looked hard enough. By the time he pulled into the same gravel lot, his chest felt tight, his breath shallow. He knew this encounter would not be like the first. Somewhere deep down, he understood that something irreversible was about to happen. The motel looked even darker than before as Daniel pulled into the gravel lot, his headlights sweeping across the cracked pavement and the peeling paint of the walls. The same flickering neon sign buzzed overhead, casting the lot in a sickly glow. He parked in the corner again, his heart pounding harder than the first time. This time, there was no illusion, no hope of connection. He was walking into a confrontation he could not escape. The air was thick with tension as he stepped out of the car, every sound amplified, the crunch of gravel under his shoes, the slam of his car door, the hum of insects in the night. He told himself he had made a choice, that he would not hand over the church's money, that he would not allow himself to be led further into ruin. But beneath that thin layer of resolve, fear gnawed at him, threatening to break him apart before he even reached the door. The room was the same as before, the curtains drawn, the stale air heavy with smoke. Alex was waiting, sitting in a chair with the same unnerving calm. The look on his face shifted when he noticed Daniel's empty hands, a flicker of irritation breaking through his mask. He asked about the money, but Daniel stood rigid, unable to speak at first. When he finally admitted he hadn't brought it, the atmosphere changed instantly. Alex's calmness vanished, replaced by cold fury. His words cut sharply, each one a reminder of the power he held, each one a threat sharpened to wound. He reached for a folder on the table and tossed it across the bed. Papers spilled out, printouts of their conversations, photographs of screenshots, even a drafted letter addressed to the church board. Proof lay scattered in front of Daniel, the physical weight of his downfall ready to be unleashed. Daniel's chest tightened as he stared at the papers, his world collapsing in slow motion. He imagined Caroline reading those words, his congregation gasping in shock, his children hearing whispers in school about their father's betrayal. Panic rose like a tide inside him, and his hands began to tremble. Alex stepped closer, his voice low but filled with venom, demanding obedience and warning that the consequences of refusal would be swift and devastating. Daniel's mind raced with no clear escape. He had tried compliance, and it had only led to more demands. He had tried silence, and it had only deepened his despair. Now, with his back against the wall, something inside him snapped. The confrontation escalated in seconds. Words turned into shouts, shouts turned into a struggle. The details of what happened next would forever remain blurred, even in Daniel's memory. The room erupted in chaos. The crash of furniture, the tearing of paper, the pounding of fists against the walls. Somewhere in the frenzied fight, Daniel's hand found an object heavy enough to strike. A single blow landed harder than he intended, followed by another, until the stillness of the room returned with terrifying finality. Alex lay motionless on the floor, his body twisted awkwardly, the folder of evidence scattered around him. The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel staggered back, his breath ragged, his hands shaking as he stared at what he had done. He had not planned this. He had come unarmed, with no thought of violence. Yet in a moment of desperation, the man who had preached forgiveness and faith had become a killer. The gravity of it weighed on him instantly. He knew there was no undoing what had happened, no prayer strong enough to erase the scene before him. He left the room in a daze, stumbling into the night air, his clothes damp with sweat, his mind spiraling into panic. By morning, the news had already begun to spread. A man found dead in a motel room, his identity revealed, his connections traced. Daniel's name surfaced quickly, his lies unraveling under the scrutiny of police investigation. The town that had once admired him reacted with disbelief and horror. Some refused to believe the accusations, clinging to the image of their pastor. Others felt betrayed, their trust shattered beyond repair. Caroline's silence cut deeper than any words could, her world destroyed by the secrets she never saw coming. When Daniel finally confessed, it was less out of strength and more out of exhaustion. He told investigators about the deception, the blackmail, the threats, but the justifications could not erase the crime. In court, the story unfolded like a tragic play, every detail exposing the depth of his fall. The jury debated whether he was a victim driven to the edge, or a man who acted out of selfish desperation. But the outcome mattered little in the end. The pastor who once preached about light had been consumed by darkness, his legacy forever stained. What remained was not just the story of a man's downfall, but a chilling reminder of how secrets can grow into traps, how temptation can spiral into destruction, and how one decision in the shadows can change a life forever. Pastor Daniel Cooper carried an image that seemed almost untouchable in his small Texas town. He was the man people turned to for guidance, the voice that comforted families during funerals, the presence that brought reassurance during weddings, and the counselor who listened to private confessions without judgment. On Sundays, he stood tall in the pulpit, his voice steady and his words carefully chosen to inspire hope. His wife, Caroline, was seen as the picture of grace, always by his side, and their 2 children were admired for their manners and accomplishments. From the outside, the Cooper family looked like a model of faith and stability, but beneath the calm surface was a hidden world of doubt, temptation, and longing that Daniel carefully concealed. It began late at night, long after the parsonage lights had dimmed and Caroline and the children had gone to sleep. Daniel would retreat to his study under the guise of preparing sermons or reading scripture. Instead, he opened his laptop, the screen casting a pale glow across his tired face, and entered anonymous chat rooms. At first it was harmless, or so he told himself. He justified the conversations as casual, insisting that even pastors needed someone to talk to outside their circles. But gradually, the words exchanged became more personal, the messages stretching into the early hours of the morning. When he met Emily, everything shifted. She claimed to be a single mother from another state, someone who struggled with her faith, but admired Daniel's strength as a man of God. Her messages were full of warmth, and she seemed to understand him in ways few people ever had. What started with innocent talk about prayer and hope quickly turned into confessions about loneliness, vulnerability, and desire. Daniel found himself looking forward to her words more than the scripture he once held closest to his heart. He erased emails, deleted chat logs, and hid notifications, carefully guarding this secret relationship from the family and church that depended on him. The thrill of secrecy became addictive. Each time he saw Emily's name appear on the screen, his pulse quickened. He began staying awake later and later, telling Caroline he was working on new ideas for sermons. His wife believed him without question, unaware that the man beside her was slowly building a double life. The guilt ate at him, but he always managed to silence it with excuses. He convinced himself that no harm was being done, since the connection was only through words. Still, deep inside, he knew he was stepping onto dangerous ground, the kind of ground that could crack and swallow everything he had built if exposed. Emily began sharing details about her life, painting pictures of struggle and hardship. Daniel felt a pull to help her, to be more than just a listener. The empathy he once reserved for his congregation now belonged to this mysterious woman he had never met. Their exchanges grew longer, stretching from quick notes into hours, long conversations filled with intimacy and trust. Daniel felt alive in a way he hadn't in years, and soon, the thought of actually meeting her began to dominate his mind. He imagined what it would be like to sit across from her, to finally match a face to the voice that had captured him so completely. When Emily suggested they meet in person, Daniel's heart pounded with a mix of fear and excitement. The idea both terrified and thrilled him. For weeks he battled with himself, weighing the risks of exposure against the craving for something he could no longer resist. Finally, he convinced himself that it could be harmless, a simple meeting between 2 adults who cared for one another. He rationalized it as a chance to give counsel, to be a comfort, though his own thoughts betrayed the innocence of that claim. He told himself that one meeting couldn't undo everything he had worked for, but deep down, he knew that agreeing to see her was the first step toward a path he might never be able to turn back from. Daniel's decision to meet Emily in person marked the beginning of a dangerous descent. Though at the time he did not recognize how far he was about to fall, he crafted his excuse carefully, telling Caroline he had been invited to a religious conference in Houston. He spoke of workshops and seminars, a full schedule that would explain why he might not answer calls right away. Caroline, ever trusting, kissed him goodbye with no suspicion in her heart. The children hugged him and waved as he pulled away, leaving behind the safe world of his home for something far riskier than he could admit. The highway stretched endlessly before him, miles of Texas road cutting through quiet fields and patches of pine trees. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing with questions he could not quiet. Would Emily look anything like he imagined? Would she see him as the man he had portrayed, or would disappointment cloud their meeting? With every passing signpost, his nerves twisted tighter, yet curiosity drove him forward. He had spent months building this connection, hiding his tracks, carving out pieces of himself he had never shared with anyone. The thought of walking away now seemed impossible. By the time he reached the small town off the highway, where they had agreed to meet, the sun had set, leaving the streets lit only by scattered neon lights and dim lamps. He checked the directions twice, his heart pounding as he pulled into the gravel lot of a roadside motel. The building looked worn down, its sign buzzing faintly, letters missing from the name. A few cars were scattered across the lot, their presence silent and unremarkable. Daniel parked in a corner, hoping to remain unnoticed, and reached for his phone to confirm the room number Emily had given him. His hands trembled as he typed, his chest tightening with the weight of what he was about to do. Minutes felt like hours as he sat in the car, staring at the door that matched the number in the message. He imagined Emily standing just beyond it, waiting with the same nervous energy. He pictured her as the kind, fragile woman he had pieced together through words and imagination, someone vulnerable yet strong in her own way. The air inside the car felt heavy, and finally, he forced himself to step out, closing the door softly behind him. His footsteps crunched against the gravel, echoing far louder in his ears than they truly were. The door opened before he even knocked. Daniel froze in place, his breath caught in his throat as the figure standing there came into view. It was not Emily. The person before him was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp features hardened by years of bitterness. His expression carried no warmth, only a faint smile that seemed to mock Daniel's shock. In that instant, the carefully woven story Daniel had clung to unraveled, leaving him standing at the threshold of something he could not understand. The stranger stepped back and gestured for him to enter. The motion was calm, almost casual, but there was a weight to it that made refusal feel impossible. Daniel's instinct screamed for him to turn and leave, to run back to his car and never look back. But pride, fear, and confusion pinned him in place. Slowly, with his pulse racing and his body tense, he crossed the threshold into the dimly lit room. The smell of stale smoke and cheap air freshener filled the air. A single lamp flickered on the nightstand, casting long shadows across the room. The curtains were drawn tight, shutting out the world beyond. Daniel's mind scrambled for answers, questions that had no form yet burned for release. The man closed the door behind them with a soft click, a sound that felt heavier than any sermon Daniel had ever preached. He realized too late that he had entered a world built on lies, one where the rules were no longer his to control. Daniel stood frozen in the center of the motel room, his eyes darting around as though searching for some explanation that would make the scene less threatening. The dim glow of the lamp threw jagged shadows across the cracked wallpaper, and every detail seemed exaggerated by his fear. The man who had lured him here introduced himself as Alex, his tone flat and cold, as if he had rehearsed this moment many times before. There was no warmth in his expression, no attempt to soften the blow. With calculated precision, Alex explained that there had never been an Emily. The pictures, the messages, the story of a struggling single mother, all of it was a trap designed to bait men like Daniel. Men who believed their secrets could be safely tucked away behind a screen. The words struck like a hammer against Daniel's chest. His heart thudded painfully, each beat filled with panic. Shame began to creep up his neck, hot and suffocating. The careful image he had built as a man of God, as a husband and father, now felt paper, thin and fragile. Alex revealed details that Daniel thought had been hidden. He spoke of Caroline and the children by name. He mentioned the church address, even referenced sermon dates that matched Daniel's online conversations. Every detail proved one thing: nothing about Daniel's life was private anymore. In the silence that followed, Daniel realized how thoroughly trapped he was. The threat hung in the air unspoken at first, but it became clear as Alex laid out his terms. If Daniel wanted to keep his reputation intact, If he wanted to protect his family and avoid public humiliation, he would need to cooperate. There was no demand for cash immediately, no vulgar exchange of threats shouted across the room. Instead, Alex spoke with a calmness that made the danger feel even more menacing. He told Daniel he would be in touch, that instructions would follow, and that compliance would ensure silence. It was blackmail dressed in quiet authority, and the more Alex spoke, the more powerless Daniel felt. Daniel sat stiffly on the edge of the bed, his mind whirling. He thought of the congregation that had placed its faith in him, of Caroline's unwavering trust, of the countless people who would never look at him the same if the truth was revealed. His reputation had been his armor, but now it was the very weapon being used against him. He nodded weakly, unable to muster resistance, though every fiber of him screamed at the injustice. Somewhere deep inside, anger began to stir beneath the layers of shame, but fear quickly smothered it. Before leaving, Alex reminded him that everything had been documented. The chats, the private exchanges, even details Daniel thought he had deleted. Screenshots had been saved. Proof existed that could destroy his life within hours. Daniel was warned that any sign of disobedience would result in everything being sent to the church board, to Caroline, and even to local news outlets. The threat was clear, and its weight pressed down like a vice. Alex's final words were delivered with a smirk, one that carried the sick satisfaction of a man who thrived on control. When the door finally closed behind him, Daniel remained seated, paralyzed by dread. The room felt smaller, suffocating, as though the walls were pressing in. He buried his face in his hands, the reality sinking deeper with every second. He had come expecting connection, maybe even intimacy, but instead he had walked into a carefully constructed snare. He left the motel in silence, driving aimlessly into the night, every mile heavy with the knowledge that his life was no longer his own. The secret he thought he controlled had become the very chain that bound him, and the man behind the deception had no intention of letting go.